Welcome to the home of debate, where we're talking today about the lack of debate in this year's political process. This is the Opinion Show, where we get together each week, members of the editorial board of the Plain Dealer and the Northeast Ohio Media Group. I'm with Opinion Director Betsy Sullivan, Deputy Editorial Page Editor and columnist Kevin O'Brien, and editorial writers Sharon Broussard and Pete Krouse. So, we're not having a lot of debates this year in the political realm. A lot of the Republican candidates have decided they don't need to have them. We want to talk about whether that's proper or not. Betsy, why don't you kick us off?
Well, you know, it is, I guess, a malady of the front runner that they really don't want to have that opportunity to stumble thrust upon them. But I do think that this almost wholesale desertion from the debates. We did have the incumbent auditor, Dave Yost, come in this week and debate at the City Club, but all of the other statewide office holders who are running for re-election have declined to do so, as well as Marcia-Fudge, who is running for re-election for Congress. So, who is, you know, in a district that is basically tailor-made for a Democrat. So, she would have nothing to fear really from showing up either. You know, it is, to me, it is denying the voters that opportunity to see the candidates in person, to ask their questions. It really shouldn't be all about this internal calculus within the campaigns, and I really think this year, you know, throws that into focus, and I think it's extremely regrettable.
It seems like this year we're in Ohio. We're being denied what you expect every 4 years in the governor's race and the other offices. A discussion of the state and where we're headed. Are we going in a good direction? Are taxes being spent correctly? It seems like that the criticism for the lack of debates is aimed at the incumbents who are not agreeing to debate. But I wonder whether there's a little bit of criticism that should be reserved for the challengers, especially in the Ed Fitzgerald's case, for running such a lackluster, bad campaign that there is no debate because people have made up their minds. The character issue has been resolved in most people's minds with some of the activities he was involved in. And so, from John Kasich's standpoint, he's going to waltz in, no reason to talk about these issues. He wants to lead. So how much of this should we put on the challengers for kind of being bozos here?
I think that's an extremely good point. If any of these elections were close, we would definitely have a debate. But let's also look at the fact, you know, at least in the congressional, that we've got districts that, you know, where a Republican almost doesn't have a chance, or where a Democrat doesn't have a chance, so there's no pressure to debate in those circumstances. The governor's race has been a disaster. If it were closer, I'm sure there would be a debate, and that was the last one where we had clarity that there wouldn't be a debate, and, you know, Ed Fitzgerald asked for 11, cut 0. Yeah. But yeah, you know, you can blame them, but I don't think they did that intentionally, you know, to be so far behind that a debate would almost be irrelevant. Even given that circumstance, I do feel the front runner should, in recognizing the public, the public interest in, you know, good governance, should have agreed to a debate.
Yeah, and I have to say that there are some lame excuses out there. I mean, State Treasurer Josh-Mandel was here meeting the editorial board, you know, a couple minutes ago, and he said, well, there are plenty of platforms. You know, there's internet, there's my town hall meetings, you know, there's all kinds of opportunities for people to come to ask questions, but that isn't true. And I think he said something really telling when he said that he didn't want to be publicly prosecuted by newspapers. You know, the idea that, you know, if you're in front of people and you have a moderator, you might be asked some very uncomfortable questions. Your challenger might bring them up because he or she is there in the same forum with you, and you might have to squirm a bit and, you know, try to reach for some answers.
I got to tell you, though, if given the choice between appearing before the editorial board for the past hour when we did that and doing a public debate,
think so?
I'd go for the public debate. That was a robust and I mean, I think we would all agree that that was difficult for the candidates. They were asking some very hard questions.
Henry Gomez was live blogging that, and so, you know, readers should look for his blogs, and we will be posting the full audio tape as well, because it really was a very interesting exchange, definitely. And yeah, full credit actually to Josh-Mandel to come in and take what he knew were going to be some very pointed questions. That still doesn't mean, though, that the public got to stand up and ask their questions.
Right. There's a
What do you think?
difference.
Does the candidate have a duty every 4 years, or incumbent have a duty to stand before a crowd and answer questions?
Well, it's a good theory, and it would probably be a good thing to do in practice, but the practical side of it says, no, there is no obligation. There's no law in the books that says you must debate. And as far as the public asking questions, there are so many more and better ways to judge how an incumbent especially has done in office. It's maybe harder to get to the challengers, especially if they're unknown or political neophytes or haven't been around as much. But man, you've got a long performance record with a lot of the incumbents, and you can at least as a voter look at that and say, I don't know that I necessarily want to vote for the opponent, but I know I don't want to vote for this guy. And I think we discount that too often.
But the difference, and let's keep it on Josh Mandel since this is fresh. Josh Mandel has been in the news a lot. There was a lot of controversy about his four-year term, and he hasn't addressed the public about that. People have not really heard a lot from him about the Ben Suarez trial, where he wrote a letter on behalf of a company after getting a big donation. We haven't really talked about some of the actions he's taken in a public forum, and the expectation normally is that before the election there'll be a public forum. He'll have to stand there and people can hear him explain himself, and that's not happening.
And it's working.
Yeah.
Because, and he knows it's working, and so he's operating according to what works. It's not as if the information isn't out there. We ran story after story after story about the Suarez situation.
But Kevin, I disagree with you. I understand what you're saying, that you could just look at the, record, look at the person's resume and say like, oh, I'll vote for candidate A or B, but that's not how people do things. If I see you, alongside of Chris Quinn, and you're both asking me for your votes, based on body language, the way you answer questions, the way you treat each other, I might, even though you may have a perfectly great record, I might say, well, I think, Quinn's more affable, he can get along with people, and there's something to be said for seeing and not just for, looking at records and then deciding who to vote for, which I don't think happens anyway, or otherwise we wouldn't talk about how sometimes women can have an edge in a campaign just because, if they have all the other credentials, then people are more likely to trust them. So there is something to be said for seeing people as well.
Yeah, there's not much to be said for it. I mean, your choice comes down to style or substance, and if you're going to base a vote on how somebody comes off in public, or whether their opponent seems to be a less than perfectly nice person, well, you're going to get the government you deserve.
No, sometimes style.
But
I think
look at the
That's what I'm saying.
Kennedy-Nixon debates. Look
Yes,
at the
that's
fact,
exactly
which
what
we
I
were
was thinking
reminded of
about.
very recently when the Republicans were looking at Cleveland. The last time they had a big presidential event in Cleveland was when Reagan debated Carter, and that debate, the only debate in that campaign, completely turned the tide for Reagan.
But should it have?
Well, okay, that's another.
Well, that's really the question.
You talk about the
But I think it's
Nixon-Kennedy
important.
debate. Nixon
It's
probably would have won that election if he didn't appear on TV and he was sweating and he had his
Right.
5 o'clock shadow and everybody was going, who is this guy? And that had a big effect on that election. But debates can be overdone. I think it's important that you have at least one debate. You can overdo it. I mean, we all know back in 2012 when each party was picking a candidate, and not the Democrats, but the Republicans, and they had about 14 debates, and after a while it was like, oh, another debate, is Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood on? So you can overdo it, but I think it's important, and I think it's, if there's a legitimate candidate, and I think in the case with Ed Fitzgerald, despite what he's gone through, he still is a legitimate candidate. Yes, he's way behind the governor, should at least do one public debate. He owes that to the people of Ohio. All of these candidates should at least do one debate. Will it make that big of a difference? Perhaps not, but it is part of the protocol, and I think they should do it.
Yeah, I get so it seems like what everybody's saying is a debate is the place where you could decide whether this is somebody you'd want to sit down and have a beer with and get judgment on whether they'd cross the aisle to work with people if they're friendly. Do you think people make up their minds based on that, or do you think they're making up their minds based on their policies and the decisions. I mean, is anybody going, say Ed Fitzgerald was running a legitimate campaign, would anybody make up their mind on whether or not to vote for John Kasich based on his performance in a debate, or are they going to vote on his record?
Some
Yeah,
would.
I think it could help, especially if someone is on the fence and thinks that both of them have, policies that they could live with. But I'm not sure if it would be definitive, that I would just make up my mind based on, what the candidates look like. I'd also want to look at their records.
But look at the reason why our editorial board does ask for all the candidates to be present at the same time, because we think, and it usually works that way, that not only gives you some insights about the personality of the candidate, but also helps to define the issues in a more substantive way, so that you're not getting simply, ladled out the talking points of one side. Again, in the Mandel interview, which we just did, having his opponent in the room, she was able to kind of keep pushing those issues that, on which she thought he was vulnerable, even though we were going to ask him the same questions, as well as he was able to push back on her on the State Street Bank. So in other words, it does help elucidate issues that maybe, voters who would primarily be exposed to somebody's issues by their television commercial wouldn't get the full flavor of.
But there's a big difference between what we did and what is normally the debate forum. We do interrupt people and say you're not answering the question, or hasten them to the end of their talking points, much more so than you get in a formal debate. In a formal debate, it often does just come down to talking points. There's not nearly as much time to have that interaction. Maybe what it ought to be is we just ought to always moderate the debates and have
I
them
was about
here.
to say, if you have a really good moderator, then I think that you can, cut people off and make sure that they stay on the right track and that kind of thing. It's a little bit trickier when you just say 2 minutes, everybody go at it and answer the question.
But there's some
Right.
thinking on your feet that's required in a debate, and I think that's an attribute that people should judge in a candidate. I mean, yeah, you look at their positions on things and their past histories, but a debate is one way to gauge a little bit of what the candidate is made up of, as opposed to his campaign and his staff and the people around him and his advisors. This is the guy. This is the man or the woman and you can size them up a little bit, I think, with a debate. And that's why I do think you can overdo it, but I do think at least one is called for.
But in the vast majority of cases, I think the skills that are called upon to do well in debate are not the same ones that are called upon to do well in office.
Agreed.
Thinking on your feet is a great thing to have in your toolkit.
Yeah.
But you're generally thinking at your desk while you're reading some
Well,
document
yeah.
or trying to figure out which policy direction to go. And that's not an off-the-cuff quick thing. That's a deliberative process that you do not see on display in debates, except to the extent that they brought their talking points out, which they do throughout the campaign anyway.
On the other hand, we have seen town hall style debates where I think that kind of what's on the voters' minds is allowed to bubble up much more than, say, in a much more structured debate where moderators are asking the question. And I think that actually also sheds light. I mean, this is one reason why in our endorsement interviews we actually solicit questions from readers, and it often helps put issues on the table that maybe we weren't aware are on people's minds. And I do think that that's important in a campaign. A campaign is not simply the candidate with the megaphone. It is also the voters being able to say, these are the issues that we really care about, and we want to be heard about them. So.
Yeah. I'm sorry. And I think it also matters, like when a candidate wins office and then goes out and has to, mix and mingle with the public. If you're shrill on stage and snapping at every question and, storming off, well, that says a lot about how you might treat me as a constituent when I come and I say, I have this issue, how can you help me with it? So I think it gives the person a glimpse into the personality, and that is important.
So now it's your chance to be part of the debate. In the comments where you're watching this video, you can put in your thoughts about it. And as Betsy just said, every time we bring candidates in, and we've been bringing them in quite a bit, we field questions from you and then ask them as part of the process. So please keep looking for those announcements and adding your thoughts. We'll see you next time on The Opinion Show.